I want to have Warren Carah come up front here. He'll be speaking about his father, Lieutenant Colonel John Carah, U.S. Air Force, who escaped capture after his B-17 was shot down over France in the summer of 1943. So please help me in welcoming Warren Carah. Thank you very much.
I must say, this is an impressive crowd. I didn't think that old planes and old pilots would gather that many people, but it has. My name is Warren Carah. I live in Brighton, and I've been studying World War II for as many years as I've probably been around. My father was the great inspiration. He dragged us from England to Spain to France to Guam to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines and several places in Japan. I never was in one place for more than a year and a half, and so I truly grew up as an Air Force brat. Given that amount of service, when the Air Force rejected me because of migraine headaches, I was kind of glad I couldn't enlist, to be honest with you. The topic for tonight is escape and evasion, and the reason that I think that it's important to us is that it's a topic that not a lot of people know a lot about. Escape and evasion is something that people kind of talked about in very, very low tones at the various fields in England during the war, and they really didn't know what to do or what they would do if they were shot down. And so they just hoped for Providence would keep them from ever having to experience that. And the reason it's not understood or well known now is that for many years, escape and evasion was a secret of the Air Force. They did not declassify a number of the documents pertaining to escape and evasion until 1990. If you were shot down during the war, you couldn't even see your own escape and evasion report until quite late. Those of you that do have relatives or friends that were shot down during the war, escape and evasion reports are now available online. You can go to the National Archives website there, and you can look up every one of them. There's 3,000 some odd escape and evasion reports now online, and you can find out what your grandfather or uncle or whatever did during the war, even if he was not willing to talk about it. Because frankly, escape and evasion was a very, very traumatic experience. Most of the crews of the aircraft were barely out of their teens. In fact, many of them were in their teens. And they were basically flying over a foreign land with a foreign language, foreign culture, and they were very inadequately prepared for the experience if they should get shot down. However, I think the persons that did get shot down and managed to escape probably demonstrated the greatest sense of perseverance and heroism I have seen in any story coming out of World War II. And I guess people ask me why I have such a passion for escape and evasion. It's simply because my dad was one. This is him. There's one thing the Air Force, the Army Air Forces did very well, is take inspirational photos of all their pilots to send home to mom and dad. And, you know, that could be a Hollywood movie poster there. But my father was born in Chico, California in 1922. Chico is a very small farming and college town at the northern end of the Central Valley of California. Sleepy would be a dynamic way of describing the town. It was a very laid-back town. My father's family were all descended from Cornish miners. They came to California for the gold rush. And obviously, since I'm here, they didn't make it big, but it did give them a good founding in engineering and things, which were passed on to the later generations. He was the youngest of three brothers. The picture you see on the lower left there, or lower right, is my father in 1942. The brother on the left eventually became head of the missile division for Douglas Aircraft Corporation, and the brother on the right came to create and head the California Water Project. So they're a very accomplished group of young men, and all came from that little tiny town in Chico, California. My father and his brothers were all fascinated by aircraft as little kids. The small airport at Chico occasionally had Stearmans and related biplanes come by, and they always went out the airport to take a look at them. They also were very active in Boy Scouts. You can see a photo of him there as a young man in Boy Scouts. And he also was a part of DeMolay, which is, I would call it as a junior division of the Masons. So he was a quite active young man. He was very community-oriented. And when World War II came along, he wanted to be a part of it. Our topics tonight, we're going to go through some things that perhaps you've seen or heard before, so we won't spend a lot of time on them, but to give you the total picture of what it meant to become an Air Force pilot for the Army Air Forces in World War II, we're going to go through from the very beginning. We're going to talk about his enlistment, his flight training, his bomber operational group training, what it was like in England, what his last mission was over the aero engine plant in Le Mans. Then we're going to get into some statistics about how dangerous it was to be in the air over Europe. Then we're going to talk about his life on a French farm, his evasion eventually to Switzerland, and then how he became a spy in Switzerland. And then he became an air attaché, and those of you that have relatives who might have been interned in Switzerland, he was the one responsible for renting all of the chalets and resorts that the 1,500 American internees stayed in after they landed their planes or parachuted into Switzerland. He got tired of doing that, and he wanted to come home. I've had many conversations with my father why he wanted to leave Switzerland. Frankly, it was the life of Riley. He didn't work that hard. He went skiing every afternoon, and there was maybe a shortage of food in Switzerland, but there was no shortage of booze. And they had a great time there. There was a number of American and British, more British than anything, and it was quite an interesting array of people. And I asked him, why did you want to leave that? And I was thinking he was going to reply in some patriotic terms that, I wanted to get back to my country and, rah, rah, rah. Turns out he had been married just the day before he left for Europe, and he says passion and lust overcame his. Then we're going to talk about his crossing of the Pyrenees Mountains, and then we'll go a little bit into his post-war career. Enlistment. When the war started, my father was goose hunting out in the rice fields of Sacramento, and shortly after that, he went down to the Army Recruiting Center in Sacramento and asked how he could join. And at that time, all pilots in the Army Air Forces had to have 4-year degrees. He was only a sophomore in his college, and they told him that they anticipated the rules were going to change, and that 2 years of college would probably allow him to apply for cadets. So he waited till his 20th birthday, which was on February 8th, 1942, and applied and was accepted. But they had no slots for him, plus they wanted him to finish up his sophomore year in college. So they sent him to the Presidio, San Francisco. If you got to do time in the Army, that's the place to do it. It's a very attractive place. Unfortunately, he spent most of his 2 months there just marching around with World War I rifles and uniforms, but it did prepare him for the future. All would-be pilots for the Army Air Forces had to go through a classification process whereby you were determined whether you would be a pilot, whether you'd be a bombardier, or whether you'd be a navigator. And it involved about a 6-week ordeal of heavy training and endless physical exercises and rather primitive existence. The picture you see there is of the Santa Ana Army Airfield where all the classification took place, and it covered just literally dozens of acres, and like most, my father ended up in a tent for 6 weeks. That's the only place they had to board them. At the end of the 6 weeks at the Santa Ana Classification Center, he was classified as a pilot, and he was sent off to his primary training. All primary training for pilots in the Army Air Forces was done by civilians. Army training didn't take place until you had mastered some parts of flying. So the primary training facilities are all run by civilians. This particular one was run by the Mesa Del Rey Airport Corporation. They ran about 6 primary training facilities in California. And they would there receive 12 weeks of training and about 40 hours of flight training to get to the first step of their flight training. All the instructors were civilians, and the planes they flew were Ryan PT-22s. Does anyone here know what a PT-22 looks like? Yeah. And I do understand we have some World War II veterans with us here, and if I do say anything incorrectly, please jump up. I'm sure you'll correct me for that. After primary training at King City, California, he was then moved down to basic training at the Lemoore Naval Air Station, an Army Air Force combined base. This is where they flew much more powerful engined aircraft. They were sent on cross-country missions. They learned night flying, navigation. They were basically learning how to become real pilots. After basic training, they then went into advanced training. You see here is that my father was stationed or assigned to the Douglas Army Airfield in Douglas, Arizona. This is right on the Arizona-Mexican border. This is a multi-engine school that was to train all the multi-engine pilots. This included P-38 Lightning pilots. Even though they were classified as fighters, all Lightning pilots had to go through the advanced flying school for multi-engine before they could be assigned as pilots. At Douglas, they were starting to get fully trained in what it meant to be an officer in the United States Army. Heretofore, they had been strictly focused on flying, but at Douglas, they learned what the responsibilities and obligations of being an officer were, and that's what most of their training was in the latter half of their advanced training. On the 6th of February, 1943, my father graduated in Class 43B and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Forces. This was 2 days before his 21st birthday. From advanced flying school, where they flew primarily 2-engine aircraft like the Curtiss AT-9 and the Cessna AT-17s, they moved over to Blythe in the Mojave Desert and got their first glance at what a B-17 looks like. If you've been flying small 2-engine planes and suddenly are told you're going to fly this monster, a lot of them really did not think it was doable. They didn't see how it could fly. But it actually was one of the most gentle airplanes my father said he ever flew. It practically took itself off. There may be pilots that disagree with that, but he thought it did very well in the air without his inputs at all. The B-17 in war mode had a crew of 10. It had 2 pilots, pilot and a co-pilot, had a navigator, bombardier, that was the officer group. Then you had a top turret gunner who also served as the plane's engineer, flight engineer. You had a ball turret gunner, and the bottom of the plane, 2 waist gunners and a tail gunner. The plane was equipped with 10 50 caliber machine guns. It was an extraordinarily rugged airplane, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen pictures of airplanes that somehow managed to come back from missions completely torn apart. It was an extremely forgiving aircraft, and my father learned that it could be a lifesaver as well. My father was a first pilot, classified as a first pilot. However, when he went to go to his operational bomb group, they named all the pilots from the Class 43A first lieutenants right away, so he was a second lieutenant. You can get your enthusiasm going later, okay? After my father finished his transition training at the B-17, he was assigned to the 533rd Bomb Squadron of the 381st Bomb Group. I'm glad to see the Yankee Museum has seen fit to name their planes after his former bomb group. And they were all taken to a godforsaken place in West Texas called Pyote. Those of you that may have been involved in Pyote after the war knew it was primarily a old airplane storage facility, but it was clawed out of the desert literally overnight in 1943, and or 1942, excuse me, and it was called the Rattlesnake Base, and there was a very good reason for that, in that there was literally thousands of rattlesnake dens on the base as they were making the runways and things. And after a long, long day of flying, a lot of the crews would just drop into bed, pull off their boots, and just drop into bed. And that turned out to be a difficult thing to deal with, because since it was in the desert, it got cold at night, and the snakes were looking for a warm place to go. So they crawled into the flight boots. And so every morning, your first routine was to shake the boots out. Pyote is where the bomb group, the 381st, primarily learned their formation flying skills. They did this something like 9 hours a day in some occasions, trying to overcome natural fears of getting your planes too close. They wanted them to be as close as you could possibly get them, sometimes overlapping the wings. The commander of the group, a gentleman by the name of Colonel Joseph Nazaro, was a stickler for this. Mr. Nazaro eventually became head of the Strategic Air Command in the Pacific Air Forces. He was a 27-year-old full-bird colonel, so that tells you a little something about him. After Pyote, everybody shook the sand out of their boots and the snakes, and they went up to Pueblo, Colorado, where they did some final training. And they then were planning to go to Salina, Kansas, where an aircraft modification center was preparing their airplanes for deployment to Europe. However, there was a little interim there, and I mentioned the passion issue. This is my mother. My father and mother were married on a one-day leave in Reno, Nevada. And there they are at the top of the mark in San Francisco on their literally 2-hour honeymoon. And he didn't see her again for another 9.5 months. This is the crew of my father's aircraft, and I'll just quickly run through and identify them, because we'll be coming back to these people periodically through the presentation. At the top left is Lieutenant Olaf M. Ballinger. He was the main pilot of my father's airplane, which was 4229992. There's my father as co-pilot. The navigator was Paul McConnell, and the bombardier was George Williams. George was from Ohio. Paul was from Alabama. My father from California, and Lieutenant Ballinger was from Ohio, Warren, Ohio. The enlisted crew consisted of Tech Sergeant Byron Gronstel, who was a Californian from Los Angeles. John Lane was the radio operator. He was from DeLand, Florida. Francis Owens was one of the waist gunners. He was from Pittsburgh. Harry Bauscher was the other waist gunner. He was from Cincinnati. William Howell was a tail gunner from Goldsboro, North Carolina. And the ball turret gunner was Albert Wackerman from Salinas, California. So there was a lot of Californians on this crew, but there was also a number of Ohioans. They deployed to Ridgewell Field, which is in East Anglia, not too far from Cambridge. On the 20th of May, 1943, they flew from Salina, Kansas with their new airplanes to Newfoundland, stayed overnight, then flew to Prestwick in Scotland, and then southeast to Ridgewell. Ridgewell was a former RAF base that the British had used for night bombing missions, so it had fairly long and substantial runways for them to use. The base housed 4 bomb groups. There were 4 bomb groups within the 381st, bomb squadrons, excuse me, in the 381st Bomb Group. And there was approximately 1,800 personnel total on the base. Each one of the squadrons had 15 crews, and each squadron had 12 planes assigned. So they had extra crews to allow rotations and make up the differences in crews due to illnesses or injuries or the loss of an aircraft. Aircraft mission availability, at least early in the war, was about 70%, which was about on par for what it was for most groups. They had, however, some horrible learning curves to do on this once they got there. For a bunch of pilots that had been trained in the desert of the Southwest, the English weather was a shock. Every day was blind flying. There wasn't a good day to be had. And so they spent the next month just trying to get used to the weather, trying to find their field. They had all sorts of problems. They were also used to these nice high-powered navigation aids and these types of things. The British navigation aids worked on less than 1/4 of a watt power output, which means you had to be right on top of them to get them. And so there was a lot of lost pilots, in the first month as they tried to get used to that. Finally, the first mission of the group came. It was on June 22nd, 1943. It was a raid on a former General Motors plant in Antwerp, Belgium. My father couldn't fly that mission because his plane was down for repairs. So the commander decided that he wanted a pilot to sit in the tail gunner's position because he wanted to find out how effective the fighter escorts were, because Antwerp was close enough where the P-47s could get out there. My father's report, which I have a copy of, is probably something that most fighter pilots wouldn't ever want to see because it was dismal performance. For a so-called milk run, the group lost 4 airplanes. And every one were KIA. And that sobered everyone up. My father, once told me that, he didn't go to war out of patriotism. He thought it was going to be a hell of a lot of fun. And I certainly, I can agree with that, or at least I could see that. But this was a very sobering moment for these people. And again, remember, we're talking 19, 17, 18, 20-year-old kids. They had to grow up very, very fast. Unfortunately, the very next day, their inexperience showed. They were loading bombs up in the 533rd Bomb Squadron, and the plane next to my father's, something happened. They dropped a bomb, and it was primed, ready to go. And in the aftermath of it, 33 people were killed, including a person in my father's plane. A piece of shrapnel came through it. You can see his plane. He named it after his wife, Connie. The astrodome had been torn off. The glass is all shattered and everything. But what you don't see, there's a big hole going right through the nose of the plane, and a piece of shrapnel took the head off the navigator who was inside. Again, a very sobering moment and a very difficult learning thing. But out of that came some good. One of my father's gunners, you remember the name Sergeant Owens, he was cleaning guns in my father's plane when this explosion occurred. He was wise enough to get the hell out of there, and he was running, and before he could clear the area, he saw one of the armorers who had been loading up the plane next to his, laying on the ground with a double compound fracture to both legs. Totally helpless, laying there. And, of course, bombs are going off. Owens stopped, turned around, grabbed the guy, and took him to safety. It was one of the most selfless and most courageous acts, I think, that I have ever heard of. But that wasn't the only time Sergeant Owens is going to be in this story for bravery, so I want you to keep that name in mind. Sergeant Owens was awarded the Soldier's Medal for that effort. In my opinion, at the end of the war, he should have been given a Congressional Medal of Honor, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I think we need to go to the sobering moment of this presentation and talk about how dangerous it was to fly over Europe in 1943. Statistics on how many planes and how many people died in the war are difficult to get at where you have agreement. but roughly 30,000 United States Army Air Forces personnel were killed in Europe during the war. That is a sizable chunk of people, most of them very highly trained. Pilots were 9 months to a year to train, same for navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, effective gunners. So we lost a tremendous number of people over Europe. Over 39,000 aircraft were lost to operational causes in Europe during the war. And that's everything from little L-19 observers on up to B-17s and B-24s. But you wonder why Willow Run was so important? They were losing planes out of the sky by the dozens every day. B-17 in those days cost about $250,000 to build, and they were losing about 25 to 30 a day. About 33,000 airmen became POWs during World War II. Being a POW was no picnic. The Germans did not provide what I would call adequate nutrition or comforts or anything that would resemble humane treatment. But 33,000 pilots, airmen, and gunners endured that for almost 4 years. Out of all those people who were shot down, roughly 2,500 to 2,700 actually evaded. So it's a fairly small number of people when you consider the total numbers that were involved. And how dangerous this is? Oh, let me tell you, the 533rd Bomb Squadron, which my father was a part of, started out with 15 crews. Only 3 made it to the 25 missions before they could go home. Only 3. Now that number improved greatly into 1944 and, of course, into 45 after the German Air Force had been shot down. But early part of the war, it was extraordinarily dangerous. Let's talk about the mission where my father finally got his feet on the ground at France. Le Mans, France, on 4th of July, 1943. It was the 7th mission of the 381st Bomb Group, and it was my father's 4th mission. And their objective was the Nomron engine factory in Le Mans, France. Nomron was a very famous French aircraft engine manufacturer. Their factory had been taken over by the Germans, and they were making engines for Focke-Wulf 190 fighters at this particular place. The mission incorporated a large number of aircraft from several different units, all in the 1st Air Division. They assembled out here over the English Channel and North Sea, and then flew down the North Sea, and one group peeled off south to go to Le Mans. Another group went over here and down to hit the submarine pens at La Police, and another group went to Nantes for a aircraft factory bombing. So there was approximately 300-400 aircraft in the air at that point in time, which at that point in the war was a major group of aircraft. The 1,000 missions that everybody likes to romance did not occur until well into 1944. It was just trying to get all these planes up in the air. It took forever to organize these large groups. Many times you were flying up blind through cloud, and you popped out of the cloud and you found yourself sitting there virtually side by side to another plane. On a couple of occasions, the only thing that saved my father, it was the fact his engineer was looking straight up as they were coming up through the clouds, and they about went into the bottom of another airplane. So you had to be very observant, and it was extraordinarily nerve-wracking. As they turned to the IP at Laval, which is right here, a flak burst hit 42-928, and there was immediate consequences. Although the aircraft controls seemed to be working fine, the interphone started lighting up with complaints that there was no oxygen at the rear of the airplane. So evidently the flak burst had severed the oxygen lines above the radio room, and the waist gunners, tail gunners could not get any oxygen. It's decision time. What do you do? There's no oxygen to the rear crew, and the interphone is out to some of the positions, so you don't know what their status is. However, all the other aircraft systems seem to be okay. The group was flying at 21,000 feet, which meant that there was some probability that if they didn't get oxygen, the crew members at the rear of the plane would probably suffer from anoxia, which is oxygen deprivation. And if you're susceptible at 21,000 feet, you could easily die. What do you do? Air Force doctrine at that time was you stayed with the group. There was protection in the group. If you went out on your own, you were dead meat. What would you do? Incidentally, if any of you haven't answered that question, please pipe up. There was somewhat of a rebellion in the cockpit of 42-29-928. The three of the officers did not want the plane to leave the formation, and that included my father, the navigator, and the bombardier. The pilot, on the other hand, wanted to go down to 10,000 feet so the crew in the rear would not be deprived of oxygen. It's a contentious point, and obviously an ethical and a moral one. What do you do? Lieutenant Ballinger made a decision he felt was right. Looking at it 70 years later, I can't say he was wrong. But it did lead to the demise of his aircraft, the death of a number of people. And to this day, if my father was here, he would still argue, keep that plane in the formation. The plane descended down to 10,000 feet, and they took a course of about 016 degrees, heading straight back to their base in Ridgewell in England. And they didn't go very far before they were beset by a number of fighter aircraft. Sergeant Wackerman, the ball turret gunner, was killed outright when a 20-millimeter cannon burst into his position. And the pilots of the German airplanes were taking pot shots. They didn't want to get too close, so they were equipped with cannons, and so they just lobbed cannon shells into the plane. And so for 50 miles, the plane was just slowly destroyed. By the time they got ready to bail out, they had 2 engines on fire. One of them couldn't be feathered. What killed the airplane was the fact that a cannon shell hit the rear horizontal stabilizer, folded it into the rudder, and then the plane went into a irrecoverable climb. They were going to stall, so they had to get out of the airplane. At 12:35 p.m. France time, the plane controls froze, and they had to make some decisions again. What happened to 42-29-928? I had the great good luck to actually get to know the pilot of the German Bf-109 that shot my father's plane down. His name was Fritz Karch. Mr. Karch had a very successful career in the Luftwaffe. He started out as an enlisted pilot in 1942 in the North African campaign. He flew FW-190s, and he claimed his first victory of a British Spitfire in about 1942. After the Allied forces finally prevailed in North Africa, he was transferred back to France, where he was based in Alencon in Normandy, and he regularly met the B-17 forces coming out of England. He recalls firing cannon into the plane, and when I told him that 2 of the people had been killed, he was very, very remorseful for that. He didn't want to talk about it. In fact, his son did most of the talking for him, and the reason for that is people don't realize it, but German pilots who actually survived the war were just hated by the German people because they blamed the fighter pilots for not protecting them from the Allied bombers. It wasn't that Karch didn't give it all. Karch was shot down 5 times in his career. And there was no R&R, there was no rest home, there was no, why don't you take it easy? They put him in another plane and up he went. And he did that 5 times. And I got to hand it to the guy, you know, that is perseverance. And obviously now we can look at it as a man doing his duty for his country. But at the same time, the guy really, really gave it all. As I mentioned, Sergeant Boucher was also killed in the exchange of fire. And as I mentioned, the killing blow came when the cannon fire blew up the horizontal stabilizer and put it into the rudder. The bailout order was given, and they started to proceed to their jump points. The officers and the front crew generally went out the front hatch, and the gunners went out the back. My father got down underneath the tunnel and was supervising the navigator, bombardier, and everything to get out of the plane when the bombardier came forward carrying his parachute in his hands. This was not an unusual accident. What had happened is that he was assisting the navigator on the front gun, and the belts went up over his head and down over his shoulders to the gun, and one of the ammunition belts caught the D-ring on his parachute and opened it inside the plane. Doctrine again said, you know, just hold it close to your body and jump out and just fling it away. Everything will be fine. At least that's what my father told him. Lieutenant Williams declined to believe that, and he said he was going to go to the rear of the aircraft and get the spare parachute that they had back there. However, there's some irony in this because the events taking place simultaneously in the back of the plane essentially sealed Lieutenant Williams' fate. You'll recall our friend Sergeant Owens. Sergeant Owens was about to bail out the back, and then he suddenly realized no one had seen the radio man. Where is he? He wasn't in the group. So Sergeant Owens went back up the length of the airplane, went around the ball turret gunner apparatus, and went into the radio room. And when he opened the door, he saw a mess. Sergeant Lane was split wide open from his hip all the way to his shoulder, bleeding profusely. You could see his lungs. His parachute inside the room was on fire, and he was in pretty sad shape. Owens grabbed the radio man, dragged him down the length of the plane, unclipped his own parachute, put it on the gunner, and threw him out of the airplane and pulled his D-ring as he left the plane. Sergeant Lane was unconscious most of this entire episode, and the minute he hit the ground, he was captured. But the Germans did put him in a hospital. He spent months there, and he survived as a POW. And thanks to Sergeant Lane, he lived another 44 years. So you can see what happened to poor Mr. Williams. He goes back to get the spare parachute, and unfortunately, Sergeant Owens had picked it up for himself and got out of the plane. The last anyone saw of Lieutenant Williams was my father, who saw him leap out of the plane when the plane was only about 300 feet above the ground. So obviously, not enough time for the parachute to open. So we can see we have an unmitigated disaster on our hands here. The aftermath. As I mentioned, Ballinger held the plane until everybody could get out. Ballinger finally got out at about 2,000 feet. The plane crashed in an apple orchard in a little village called La Coulange in Normandy at about 1240 wartime. As we mentioned, Lieutenant Williams didn't get out of the plane in time. We know Sergeant Owens saved the life of Sergeant Lane. Sergeant Gronstel, the engineer, unfortunately scraped across the bottom of the airplane when he parachuted out, and it lacerated his face and neck rather severely. And he went to a French farmhouse when he got to the ground to get some aid, and unfortunately he was captured there. So he became a POW with Lane. The rest of the crew scattered. They went all over the place. They had the rather bad luck of landing right in the midst of some maneuvers of a German regiment. So there was about 5,000 German troops right in the area where they landed. Incidentally, one of the benefits of parachuting, if you want to call it that, is that you get this real nice letter from the Caterpillar Club. Do you know what the Caterpillar Club is? The Irving Air Chute Company, which was based in Buffalo in those days, made most of the parachutes that American airmen used. And they were made out of silk. And so the Irving Air Chute Company had acres and acres of mulberry trees where they had caterpillars spinning silk for these parachutes. And so if you successfully parachuted using an Irving Air Chute parachute, you got this real nice letter from the Caterpillar Club. Congratulations on surviving. You got a nice little gold pin with ruby eyes on it. And so that there is some consolation for hitting the silk, so to speak. Obviously, the events that occurred on July 4th, 1943 resulted in one of these. Thousands of these were going out every week to missing airmen, soldiers, etc. General William Ulloa probably has his name on more telegrams than any man in history, because his department, the Department of War, the ones that sent out the notifications to the parents or wives that their loved one was missing in action. And as you can see here, there's not a lot of comforting information there. He's missing. And my mother had no idea what had happened to him. Well, once you get into France as an American airman, it's not very, very attractive proposition. Fortunately, the crew did land near a large forested area called the Andane Forest. So they could hide in the forest in the underbrush because, as I mentioned, there was a large German detachment searching for them. Lieutenant Ballinger and Sergeant Owens managed to meet up with one another, and they approached a farmer named André Geslin. And Mr. Geslin, with the help of the local resistance leader, a guy named André Mazaline, put him up in their farm. It was not a very nice existence. It was in a tool shed, but at least they were safe. The navigator McConnell and tail gunner Howell met up with a auto engineer by the name of André Rougeron. André Rougeron was a auto engineer and did a lot of the engineering for Citroen's racing program before the war began. He owns a mansion in a town called Domfront, which is about 5 miles from the crash site. And he took the two airmen in. They dressed Sergeant Howell up as a Boy Scout. He was so young looking, he looked like a boy. So they put him in a French Boy Scout uniform, and he stayed that way the entire time he was in France. My father was kind of separated from the rest of them, and he did finally take shelter in a cabin that belonged to a forest ranger. That's this right here. This, by the way, is André Rougeron. Here's Ballinger and Owens with the Mazaline family. Here's, I can't see that very well here. Here's Sergeant Howell and Lieutenant McConnell at the Rougeron farm. As you can see, it wasn't all bad. They did get, wine, and, the French managed to save their wine. They may have been starving to death, but they always had plenty of wine. My father hid in this cottage for about, 6 or 7 hours, and he decided he needed to start looking for a way to get south. Unfortunately, the briefings that they had received in England didn't tell them a whole lot about what they were supposed to do when they get on the ground. They were issued a compass. I think he had 2,000 francs in French money, and he was told, just go south and get to Spain. That's all they told him. So he felt that in order to do that, he had to get out of his uniform. So he took a chance and watched a French family's farm for about 3 or 4 hours until it started getting dark. And he was so thirsty. He was injured. He had a piece of flak in his foot. He thought he would take a chance and go to the farm. And so He couldn't speak French. They couldn't speak English, but he indicated that he was very thirsty. And he saw a pitcher sitting on the table there, and he asked if he could drink that. And the French farmer said yes. So he poured himself a big glass full, and he drank it. And about halfway down, he realized it was not water. It was Calvados. And those of you that have ever had that probably never speak again the right way. It's an extraordinarily potent brandy, apple brandy, and about 190 proof level. I think every epitomal cell in my father's throat was destroyed at that point. And the fact he couldn't speak French didn't make any difference after that. He was just gasping. So there is in moments of humor amidst all this terror. My father was eventually picked up by a French policeman and taken away to a farm owned by Louis and Gabrielle Breteau. They lived in a village called Mayenne, or Lassay in Mayenne, which is about 13 miles away from the crash site. You can see the picture here of my father still in his flight uniform. They wore overalls or fatigues, and he had his uniform underneath that. He had the good fortune of getting to a family that had 3 young daughters, 18, 19, and 20, and they couldn't do enough for Lieutenant Carah. They just could not do enough. Here they are here, the Breteau sisters. They ended up being a great family friend, and up until the end of my father's life and their life, they corresponded with one another. But they just fought with one another to make sure that they took good care of Lieutenant Carah. Mm-hmm. My father, by the way, didn't tell me what he did with his wedding ring when he saw it. Yeah, why would he tell me? Yeah. Touche. At the Breteau Farm was another airman, a guy named Reynold Lasher, who was with the 95th Bomb Group, had been shot down earlier that year in May over Rennes, France, which is in Brittany, and he had walked to the Breteau Farm and was staying with the Breteaux. So they were helping 2 American airmen at their location. Although it was kind of isolated farm, the Germans were there almost every other day doing spot searches and things, so it became very dangerous for the Breteaux to house both Mr. Lasher and my father. And so they knew they had to get out of there. Things were getting too hot. They were thinking about how they're going to get to Spain, but the underground told them that getting to Spain was almost impossible. The Germans had the border pretty well blocked off, and they were kind of despairing of what they were going to do. Out of the woods, so to speak, comes a young man called Daniel Chevet. Daniel Chevet was 18 years old, and he wanted to join the Free French. That was his goal in life, was join the Free French. And he made the suggestion, instead of going to France, why don't we go to Switzerland? And that's what they did. Here's a picture of, this is Daniel Chevet here as a young man. This is Reynold Lasher. This is Reynold Lasher's dog tag. I found that in the National Archives. Families that helped U.S. airmen could prove they did so by producing the dog tag of the airmen that they had helped. Because the Army Air Forces regularly dropped leaflets over Europe, particularly in France, Belgium, and Netherlands, saying if you help an American airman, you will be compensated for your cause. And all you have to do is prove, that you helped. In many cases, just a dog tag is all they needed. So that's where that dog tag came from. Let's talk about escape networks, because they're very, very important to the saving of lives. There was 4 major escape groups that existed in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. One is called the Pat O'Leary Line. The other one's called the Comete Line. Then the Francois Shelburne Line, which was primarily a escape line to take airmen to the English Channel and then over to England. There was dozens of small and temporary escape lines. Approximately, the networks helped around 2,700 Americans and about 2,300 British escape. About 14,000 French, Belgian, and Netherlands, Dutch patriots helped American airmen get out during the war. Of that 14,000, a good half of them ended up in jail, executed, or in some way, shape, or form sent to concentration camps. It was a very deadly business being a helper. And when I think of the amount of courage it took in a very, very hostile environment to continue to help American airmen when there really wasn't that great a benefit to doing so, I pull my hats off to these guys. They were remarkable people. The Pat O'Leary line was started in 1940. How many of you saw the recent movie Dunkirk? Wasn't it a good movie? I think there were some aspects of it I wish they had been a little more detailed on. But nonetheless, most of the escapees from Dunkirk were sent down south by the Pat O'Leary line. Pat O'Leary is actually a nom de guerre for a Belgian doctor who formed the line to help British and French soldiers escape from Dunkirk instead of being forced into the sea. Their primary routes were to get the evaders to Paris, and from Paris straight south to Toulouse, then to Andorra, and into Spain. From Spain, they were generally then picked up by the British. Interestingly enough, Americans were not that active in the escape lines in Europe. The Brits did almost everything, and from supplying weapons and radios to the underground to organizing the escape lines. Once they were in Spain, all evaders were given British passports, so they could then freely go to Madrid and then to Gibraltar to get back home. But most people don't realize the entire escape and evasion apparatus all through Europe was all a British and French deal. One of the terrible things that happened to most of these lines is that they were eventually penetrated by the Gestapo. Regrettably, there were a number of French traitors who, for reasons of money or fear, betrayed a number of their colleagues. The post-World War II era, France was probably the most, lethal to their traitors. For example, post-war collaborators in Belgium, not a single person ever went to jail or was executed. In France, almost 200,000 Frenchmen were imprisoned for collaboration, and over 2,000 were executed. They take this very seriously in France, and to this day, they are humiliated and embarrassed about what happened with the collaboration that took place. So, although when I talk to a helper who is there, I'm very careful usually of how far I take it, because it is an extremely painful point in their history they don't like to discuss. The Comete Line was formed in 1941 by a group of Belgians. Again, since Belgium and the Netherlands were right on the flight paths for most bombers going to and from Germany, they did get the majority of the air crew that were parachuting out. This particular line kind of floundered for a while until a young woman named Andrée Dijon was sent to England and sent specifically to a spy school, an escaper school, so she could organize an escape line that would get more airmen effectively out of France, Netherlands, and Belgium. She established a network of helpers that would supply food, clothing, and medical assistance to literally thousands of would-be evaders. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how much of a burden an escaped airman was to a typical French family. France was nothing more than a supply warehouse for Germany during World War II. The French were that close to starvation. Everything that came out of the ground went to Germany. All their young men were sent to Germany as laborers. And when a big strapping American came along and could eat in one meal what the Frenchman would allow himself 1 week to eat, it became a real problem. And it was quite a burden, to deal with Americans. And typically, it was very difficult to even hide an American. Let's do a little audience participation here. How do you think you could tell an American in France? Anybody? Talking was certainly a big problem, but assuming you could deal with that issue, how could a person tell an American from 100 yards away?
Tall.
Pardon? His shoes. The French had no leather. They'd been all taken to France, so all shoes are made out of cardboard in France. And here are these Americans wearing these nice, highly polished GI shoes. The first thing they needed to do was scuff them up real good. What else gave away an American?
Size.
Well, certainly size. Remember Sergeant Owens? He was 6'6". The average Frenchman was 5'6". Every American you saw on the street was wearing high water pants. That's one way you could tell. What other ways could you tell an American?
Wristwatch and cigarette ring.
Well, something to do with cigarettes, not necessarily the brand. The way Americans smoked was totally different than the European way of smoking. Americans typically hold their cigarette between their two fingers. Frenchmen do this way. And it was a giveaway because the Gestapo would just sit there and watch the streets, and for anybody holding a cigarette like this, they went after. What other habit did Americans have that gave them away?
Posture.
Pardon?
Posture.
Posture? They always act like they own the place. Frenchmen learned to be very meek around Germans and Gestapo. The Americans just saunter up there and it wasn't. The other thing Americans did that irritated the French no end and gave them away is this habit of putting their hands in their pockets. And if they had change, they liked to jingle it. It gave away hundreds of Americans. If they had only given simple instruction to them while they were still in England not to do these things, probably a lot more of them would have escaped. But they didn't. Again, the Comete Line was very successful, but it eventually was infiltrated by Gestapo and by some very sneaky Gestapo. A lot of people don't realize that a number of young German men who had immigrated to the United States or were the children of first immigrants to the United States returned to Germany at the beginning of the war. They felt it was their patriotic duty to support their home country. They spoke excellent American English, and they posed as down fighters, or flyers, to get into these escape lines so they could betray them. And there were many of them that were extremely good at this, and this is what destroyed the Comete Line, where Americans, German Americans, posing as airmen who were giving away the underground groups that were helping them. And it destroyed the Comete Line entirely. However, the Comete Line by itself did save about 400 evaders. The Bourgogne or the Burgundy line was a more recent line established in 1943 by a guy named George Brosine. He saw all the inefficiencies that were taking place in Comete and O'Leary, and he set up headquarters in Paris and was extremely efficient in getting American and British airmen south through Toulouse over the Pyrenees Mountains in Andorra. However, during the winters of 43, 44, the Pyrenees at Andorra, a very high altitude, extremely poor weather. A lot of airmen froze to death up there. And so they moved operations to the southeast, to Perpignan, where the mountains are somewhat lower, I think only about 6,000 feet. And they took out some 900 airmen by themselves. The Burgundy line, incidentally, is the line that eventually helped my father out of the area. Here's a map just showing the various escape lines. As you can see, the hub was Paris. Everybody came to Paris, where they were organized, fed, and then transport arranged to go to points south. The goal, obviously, was to get to Spain. Spain, however, wasn't the sanctuary you might think it was. The Spanish believed and took into custody any American or British airman that came through as an internee. However, the Spanish were quite practical about these things, and that you could easily bribe your way out of jail. And that's a number of American evaders ended up in a Spanish jail, and either the consulate would come around once a month and get them out, or they would pay their jailers and they would get out. It was a very friendly deal. It was all a money-making operation as far as the Spanish were concerned. Once in Madrid, the Americans went from Barcelona to Madrid. They got cleaned up. They were given, again, new identities, usually as British subjects. They then were taken by train or boat to Gibraltar, where they caught British aircraft either for North Africa or back to England. And all of them, as I said, terminated down in Gibraltar. Barcelona was the big point. That's where the British consulate was located. They received anywhere between 50 and 150 airmen every day there. So they had a big job to do. They had to clothe these people, get them identification, get them in hotels, and get transport done. Okay, let's get back to our would-be escapers. They're down on the ground now in Normandy, and they need to get out. On August 5th, Lieutenant Lasher and my father with Mr. Chevet started their trip to try to get to Switzerland. They drove down to the town of Laval, which is right here. In a moving van. They were packed in with some furniture. And, of course, as you know, Laval is where the plane got its first shot of anti-aircraft fire, so it was interesting for him to go by the anti-aircraft batteries that shot him down originally. They ended up in a train station in Laval. It was full of Germans, and basically they just tried to blend in with the people. They all carried French identification of various types. They also carried what is called volunteer worker permits. The Germans drafted all young men 18 years of age, French citizens, to work in Germany. However, if you volunteered to work in Germany, you got preferences to where you would go. So the underground forged documents saying they were volunteer workers going to Germany, so they got priority on the train. They did manage to get to Paris without incident. However, something about Lieutenant Lasher just simply rubbed the Gestapo the wrong way. They asked him for identification over and over and over again. Lieutenant Lasher's cover was that he was a blind, deaf mute. Evidently, not everyone believed that because he was stopped many, many times, but he was never detained. He always was let go. And I don't know. Lieutenant Lasher was a very taciturn person. He didn't like people. Basically, he liked to be alone. So the deaf mute kind of fitting personality very nicely there. So once they got to Paris, they arrived at the train station called Montparnasse. That's this picture right here. The French take their train stations very seriously. They're very, very striking architectural buildings. And this was located on the northwest side of Paris, right near the Eiffel Tower. They had to cross the Seine River to get to their departing train station, which was the Gare de Lyon, which was on the east side of town. So they got to see Paris as tourists, and they got to see the same view that Mr. Hitler saw a few years earlier. And my father has a picture just like that, only, of course, without Mr. Hitler in there. But they made their way by subway to the Gare de Lyon. Again, Lasher was repeatedly asked for identification and repeatedly let go, fortunately. As they approached the French frontier, they left the Gare de Lyon about 10 o'clock at night, and they took the train down to a city called Dijon. They arrived in Dijon in the evening, and it was pure chaos there. Evidently, a British bomber mission had pretty much destroyed the train station at Dijon. There was an extremely upset colonel who was out to blame anybody and everybody he could, and he forced everybody off the train and was interrogating everybody. But fortunately, he gave up in disgust before he got to my father and Lieutenant Lasher. So they didn't have to answer to the colonel for why the British bombed his train station. After several hours, they were then re-allowed to get on the train, and they went on down to a town called Besançon, where they stayed there with a member of the resistance for a couple of days. Then they walked to a small village. They did a lot of walking, by the way. Not all of this was train. They walked probably 50, 60 miles just going to and from train stations. They were driven then to a small little, in a small delivery truck to Morteau, which is, right here, where in about 10 in the evening, they started to cross the border into Switzerland. This point at the French-Swiss border is called the Jura Mountains. It's fairly rugged, fairly steep country, and it is extremely hard to get your bearings. In fact, Mr. Chevet lost his way, and they were going in circles until my father remembered he had a compass. So they got to the border, and they could observe Swiss guards, and but there was no wire, there was no fencing, there was no anything to prevent them from getting in, and they walked into Switzerland around 10 o'clock that night. I've got several pictures here. You'll notice the fairly chummy relationship between the Swiss border guard and the German border guard. We'll talk a little bit about Swiss politics in a minute, but they certainly were friendly people. The Swiss kept guards all the way up into the mountains. They treasured their freedom, they treasured their privacy, and they made sure their borders were sound. Once into France, my father, Lieutenant Lasher, caught a cab and had it take them to the American legation here in Bern. This is a modern photo of 29 Thuenstrasse in Bern. This is where the American legation, the military attache's office, was located. When they got to the military attache's office, they had no money to pay the cab. So they walked up to the legation door, knocked on the door, and a colonel by the name of Richard de Jong, who was the assistant military attaché, answered the door. And my father, dressed as a civilian, said, "I'm Lieutenant Carah, could you please pay the cab driver?" Not a good reception at all to that. So, the process when you got into Switzerland involved a very serious question of what your status was, and we're going to talk about that now. Does anyone know anyone who was interned in Switzerland or in Sweden or in Portugal during the war? The Geneva and Hague Conventions have a distinction between who an invader is and who an internee is. According to the convention, an internee is a member of a belligerent military party who enters a neutral country for their own convenience. Neutral countries have the right to intern that person, control their movements, and keep them from returning back to their military units. Internees typically would be pilots who landed their plane in Switzerland or airmen who parachuted into Switzerland. They did this for a number of reasons. They had a badly injured crew member, they were running out of fuel, the plane was very badly damaged, it wouldn't make it back to England. All told, about 1,500 Americans landed in Switzerland during the war. And they were classified as internees. Others entering Switzerland that were in immediate pursuit by Germans were classified as an invader. That is, if you were on foot, basically, and entered Switzerland, if you could get there with the Germans behind you, you were allowed basically free access to any point within Switzerland. And Lieutenant Lasher and my father were classified as evaders. My father was the second person to ever enter Switzerland as an evader from the United States Army Air Forces. The British had been there already for a number of years, since obviously since Dunkirk in 1940. But my father was the second, and fortunately, classified as an evader, he's essentially given all the rights of citizenship. Switzerland in World War II was a chaotic place, despite the fact that the Swiss were extraordinarily control freaks. There were thousands of refugees in Switzerland during the war. There was, every nationality you can think of. There was French, Poles, Hungarians, British, Russians, Czechs, Balts, thousands and thousands of people. That included about 1,500 American internees who had either parachuted or landed there. And by 1944, at the end of 1944, about 150 evaders. That is, Americans that had either crashed or parachuted into France, the Low Countries, or even Germany for that matter, and had escaped to Switzerland. The Swiss army was extremely strong. For a neutral country, they had probably one of the most formidable armies in the world. Every citizen of Switzerland was a soldier. You had mandatory conscription at the age of 18. You were taught how to fight, and you took your weapons and your uniforms home with you. And so they were readily available to you if the need should ever arise. The Swiss were extremely dependent on the Germans for food. I think I've already mentioned there's an extreme shortage of food in France, and in Switzerland the same way. And the Germans needed Swiss for the food. The Swiss government was primarily, I think, more in favor of Germans than they were before, but nonetheless, the Swiss people were pretty much for the Allies. So you had kind of a dichotomy taking place where the government was pro-Germany and the citizens were pro-Allies. Once he was in Switzerland, he started a new career path. Once he arrived in Switzerland, he was placed in quarantine. All evaders were placed in quarantine. This is the Gurtenkulm Hotel. This is in the hills up above Bern. All internees had to spend 30 days there to go through kind of a well, anyway, they had to go there. As I mentioned, they were classified as evaders, and jobs were kind of hard to come by at the American legation. My father asked and was given the opportunity to be named as the Assistant Military Attaché for Air in Bern. And it was a very interesting job. He worked for a guy named Barnwell Rhett Legge. General Legge was a highly decorated World War I veteran and had been in the diplomatic side of the Army for a number of years. He served as America's representative to the Vichy government in France before Germany declared war on the U.S. And when the war was declared, he moved to Switzerland. And my father was assigned to deal with two basic issues. One was the growing internee population in Switzerland, and also he was assigned to assist in espionage activities. Some of the pictures you see here, here's my father's identification as a newly minted diplomat. And here's his Swiss ration card here. Everything in Switzerland was rationed. This is a picture of General Legge right here. 10 minutes. So how did he turn from a second lieutenant into a leasing agent and a spy? One of his duties was to find homes for these 1,500 interned airmen And what they ended up doing is leasing hotels, resort hotels in the ski resorts in Switzerland. With the war going on, there wasn't a lot of skiing going on, at least from a recreational standpoint. So they would rent entire hotels to put the intern airmen into. These were established in the towns of Davos, Adelboden, and Wengen. What was interesting is a lot of people don't realize this. There was a lot of Germans interned in Switzerland. They flew their planes in and landed because they were hurt or run out of fuel. And these hotels were directly across the street from one another. So there was interesting fireworks that usually took place every evening. My father's other job was to work for a man named Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was the OSS lead in Switzerland and in Europe during World War II. And my father was his chief coder for all the messages he sent back and forth between the State Department and War Department and Switzerland. So he was eyewitness to a great deal of history that never was revealed until quite recently. He handled all of the coded exchanges, for example, from the Abwehr assassins would-be assassins of Hitler. He knew all about that. He was not allowed to even talk about it until 1980 some odd. But he handled all those communications for Allen Dulles. However, that passion factor started weighing heavily on his mind, and he decided he wanted to go home, and he asked for permission to leave Switzerland. And so he was teamed together with 6 other evaders. They were all British with the exception of one. And they authorized his return over the Swiss border back into occupied France in January 1944. Here you see my father is now Jacques Dupont. He's a salesman for a silk company in the town of Lyon. And his mother was Marie Violet. And his father was, who was his father? Jean. He studied Jean Dupont very carefully, and this is the ID that he carried. This right down here is his work permit, and the company he worked for, Soares de Stunze, was a silk manufacturer who made parachutes for the German army.
Did your father speak French?
He spoke good Spanish, which helped. He learned a lot of French when he was in Switzerland, but mainly he learned German because most of the area of Switzerland he was in was the German-speaking area of Switzerland. His comrades in escape, these are the Britishers he left Switzerland with. Squadron leader Fletcher von Taylor, he was a Canadian. Flight Lieutenant Frank Lambert with 35th Squadron. The only other American was Second Lieutenant Ralph Bruce, who was with the 92nd Bomb Group. Flight Sergeant Hugh Calhoun with RAF 101. He became Executive Vice President of British Petroleum after the war. The next character, Chief Petty Officer Donald Lister of Her Majesty's Submarine Seal. How does a submariner get to Switzerland? Mr. Lister, for those that are interested in escape and evasion, is one of the more celebrated characters of the genre. He had his submarine blown out of the water in the Baltic Sea in 1940. And he was captured by the Germans and was taken to a prison camp in northern Germany and Prussia, which he promptly escaped from. He was recaptured and placed in another prison and captured and escaped again. They decided to take him to Colditz. Colditz was the escape-proof prison of Germany. He didn't see any way out of that, but he soon realized he was the only enlisted man amongst all the officers that were at Colditz. He prevailed on the German sense of honor that it was improper for an enlisted man to be with officers this close. And so, yes, you're right, so they transferred him to a coal plant in Poland, where he escaped from, and since he spoke excellent German, he went back into Germany, caught a train, and crossed the border into Switzerland. And Mr. Lister's passed away back in the 1970s, but I did talk with his daughter, and they have recordings of him telling this story, and it's far funnier than I am on it, but he was quite a character. Rounding out the group is Sergeant Eyre. Sergeant Eyre was with 207th Squadron, and Sergeant Richard Brown, all British. The first steps to freedom is that the Swiss escorted them to the French border, and they left. They entered the French area of Haute-Savoie, which is in the French Alps, basically, and they were taken to a little village called Frangy.
See that right here? Here's Geneva right here. They walked to Vire, and they went to Frangy.
And they thought they would be in Frangy just a matter of a day or two, catch a train for Perpignan, and they would be over the mountains. Unfortunately, the day they crossed the border is the day the Germans decide to take over all of southern France. Up until that point in time, the French Vichy government had control over the southern half of France, and Germany only occupied the northern half of France. There had been so many assassinations of German officers that they decided they were going to take over the entire country. And unfortunately, that occurred just as they arrived in Frangy. And so they did not have an opportunity to escape for some time. This is the French farmhouse that my father stayed in. Remember, this is January in the mountains. There's no heat in this building. And they spent 3 weeks there. The other building is where the other half of the group stayed. This was in the village of Frangy. There was 8 people inside 2 rooms, and they all smoked. The fire department was called several times because they thought the apartment was on fire. So. There were a number of heroes in the French underground and resistance, and this is 2 of them. The farm that I just showed you, the stone farm, was owned by a man named Charles Blanc. Charles Blanc was a former ski instructor, and when the armistice was signed in 1940, he made a vow to himself that he was going to do whatever he could to get back at the Germans for destroying his country. So he decided he was going to help by joining an organization called Organisation Resistance Armée. It's one of the many resistance groups that were fighting the Germans, and he took it upon himself to shelter American and British airmen that came through the area. He purchased that farm, that stone farm, specifically for that purpose, to hide evaders. His wife, Laurence, was also a member of his group, and she helped him in any way, shape, and form she could, and she actually escorted a number of the Americans in their escapes from the area. As I mentioned, they got stuck because the Germans took over the railway system, and at the same time, Mr. Blanc had 2 of his associates arrested by the Gestapo, and the Gestapo also broke up the escape organization in Perpignan. So my father and the 7 cohorts were stuck in Frangy for about 3 weeks until things could get resolved. The problem they had with Mr. Blanc is that he was not very concerned with security measures, and he often sent open language telegrams back to them telling them, you know, the train will be here, you'll catch it there, and of course anybody could read these things. And it turned out to be Mr. Blanc's downfall because the Gestapo eventually did read his telegrams. Finally, after the 3 weeks, they finally got their break, and they managed to get down to Perpignan. They took trains from, they crossed the Rhone River on rowboats. They couldn't use the roads because they were controlled by the Germans. They crossed the Rhone, went to a very small train station, got tickets, went to Lyon, down to Narbonne, and eventually to Perpignan, where they were met with by members of the Burgundy escape group. Once in Perpignan, they were split up. My father and Lieutenant Bruce stayed with Suzanne Deduc. Suzanne Dudu was a French teacher of English. She'd spent a lot of time in America in the 20s and 30s. You can see her calling card here when she taught in Massachusetts. She returned to France at absolutely the worst time. She returned in August of 1939, and then the war started, and she was stuck there. Her sister Lucy, however, did stay in the United States for the rest of her life. When they arrived in Perpignan,
Someone were put into the Center Hotel. This is the Center Hotel right here. And after they'd been there for a few days, they went to this graveyard to assemble to cross the Pyrenees Mountains.
There's two guides that they had going up the mountains. One was Joseph or Jose Marsal, this person you see right here. Jose's family had been displaced from Spain during the Civil War, and they had moved to France, but he was a Catalonian. Also, the other guide was Joseph Ferrasola. Ferrasola was also a Catalonian and a smuggler. Most of the guides going over the mountains, the Pyrenees Mountains, were smugglers. They knew all the routes. They knew how to avoid all the authorities. They only traveled by night, and they slept during the day. Remember, this is January. It's cold, it's wet, and they have very inadequate clothing. They finally reached the Spanish-French border on the 30th of January, and they could see the lights of Figueras, which is down in the valley below them, about 25 miles. Here on this map,
It's kind of hard to see, but they basically came through this way and then eventually down to Barcelona.
once in Barcelona, they were instructed to go to the British consulate. It was located in the Urquinaona Plaza in Old Town Barcelona. This is a old postcard I found of the plaza. This big triangular building here at the bottom floor was the British consulate. That's where all of the would-be evaders went to get new identification, new clothing, etc. When they got there, the consulate was closed. Being in Spain, it didn't open up until 4 in the afternoon. So they spent all day in this nice little park here until they could get into the consulate. After 2 days, all of the evaders in the group were taken to Madrid, where they were given new clothing, new IDs, and eventually they were taken down to Gibraltar and transferred to England and/or North Africa. And while this was a successful escape, not all of them turned out that way. I take you back to our friend Sergeant Owens. As you'll recall, he and Lieutenant Ballinger were together. They finally got to Paris, went to Toulouse, and then were starting their climb up the Pyrenees Mountains. Lieutenant Ballinger, who was in terrible shape, he hadn't eaten right for months, started developing terrible cramps in his legs, and he couldn't climb any further, so he was left behind. Another party in the escape group grew terribly ill. Unfortunately, he had taken too many dexedrine, what those are, stimulants. A lot of pilots carried those. He ate too many of them, and he became sick, and Sergeant Owens dragged him up the mountains, almost 40 miles. In the process, he totally exhausted himself, and when they reached the border of Andorra, Sergeant Owens collapsed. He couldn't go any further. The rest of the party was in no better shape than he was, and unfortunately, they had to leave him behind. Sergeant Owens' remains were not found for another year and a half. An American Graves Registration Unit queried the local villagers if any strangers or Americans had been found in the mountains, and indeed they had. Sergeant Owens had been buried in a pauper's grave with no name in the village of Arinsal. They were excavated and returned to an identification laboratory in Belgium, and his mother and father finally learned his fate in September 1951. His parents by this time were very ill, and they elected to have him buried at the American Military Cemetery in Belgium. And this is his grave right here. This is what the Pyrenees look like in winter. It was a terrible, terrible ordeal to get over those mountains. And unfortunately, Sergeant Owens paid with his life. But if anyone represents the character of the greatest generation, I feel it was Sergeant Owens. And I've had the good fortune of being involved in honoring him in a number of ways. The Air Force has named several locations after Owens. And to this day, he's celebrating in his hometown of Pittsburgh. Homecoming. Well, father finally got home, and there you can see some newspaper deals of him finally reunited with my mother. And after some R&R, my father was assigned to the Flexible Gunnery School at Tyndall Field in Florida, which is basically toying around targets for gunners to take pot shots at. He didn't particularly like that, and so he had asked for an assignment with the Air Transport Command in the ferrying unit, and he was transferred to the Fairfax B-25 plant in Kansas City, where he ferried B-25s all over the world. His most dangerous assignment, he says, is more dangerous than flying his bomber, was taking B-25s up to Ladd Field in Fairbanks, Alaska, and turning them over to the Russians for the Lend-Lease program. He said that it was terrible weather, going up in the wintertime at 44, 45, and he twice had to land his plane on frozen lakes because of engine trouble. So fortunately, he made that. Later in the war, he became a trainer of reserve pilots, and he finally had his life dream fulfilled when he checked out in the P-51. He had never flown that airplane, and he finally got to do that. Little epilogue here. My father was a career Air Force officer. He became a project manager and communication specialist. Those of you who are in the Air Force probably know the Aerospace School of Medicine in San Antonio, Texas. He was the builder of that facility. As I mentioned, we lived most of our lives overseas, and he retired in 1966 as a lieutenant colonel. He wrote his memoir in 1990. And I edited it and added and published it in 2006. And if any of you would like copies, I've got a few of them here. I could be glad to sell you some. Also, from an epilogue standpoint, father was reunited with Daniel Chevet, his guide to Switzerland in 1999. And Daniel is still living, believe it or not. He's 97 years of age. I told you, wine makes it, man. This is Joseph Marsal, Jose Marsal. This is his guide that took him over the Pyrenees Mountains. Mr. Marsal passed away about 5 years ago, but before he did, my brothers and I wanted to thank him for helping our father, and we gave him a replica A2 jacket, and you can see him wearing it there. And regarding Sergeant Owens, a group of us put together a memorial trek, basically following the route he took on his escape and evasion from Normandy to Andorra. And the group you see pictured here are the descendants of the guides and helpers that helped him get there, and also Sergeant Owens' grandniece. And also representatives from the Air Force attended. And this picture was taken on the spot where Sergeant Owens died in 1943 in Andorra. Just a quick blip on some of the other crew members. Lieutenant Ballinger did manage to get himself by himself over the Pyrenees Mountains. He returned to the States, became a B-24 instructor pilot, and eventually left the service in 1945. Unfortunately, he was killed by a drunk driver in an auto accident in 1955. Paul McConnell, the navigator of the airplane, became a successful marketing executive. He then owned his own insurance company for a number of years in California, and he passed away in 2000. Byron Gronstol was a POW. He was there to the bitter end till May 5th, 1945. He returned to Los Angeles. He took up his occupation as a carpenter, and he passed away in 1981. John K. Lane, remember, he's the man that was saved by Sergeant Owens. He returned back to his home in DeLand, Florida. He became an employee of the Postal Service. And he did so until his death in 1987, about 44 years after his life had been saved. He was always disabled from his wound, but he was very active in veterans groups while he was still living. Whoops. And William Howell. William Howell was the last member of my father's crew to pass away. He passed away in 2009. He also was a carpenter and was quite active in his church. Sergeant Howell was very, very helpful to me in putting together this presentation and the book we wrote, because he recalled so many of the incidents that took place inside the plane that no one else would have been able to see. I do have a number of suggested readings, and we're not going to go through that right now, but if you would like this list, just please see me. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Are there any questions I can answer for you? Yes, sir.
So the planes that were flown into Switzerland by those that were later interned, were they ever made available to the people like your father that could fly them to Spain to escape?
No, the Swiss disabled the airplanes, and they weren't going anywhere once they were in Switzerland. Yes, sir.
When your father was leaving France initially, there was two others with him. One spoke fluent French, I presume. The other one was a mute.
Pretended to be a deaf mute, yes.
And what was your father, when he was queried by the Germans, how did he respond?
I really don't know. He said it was all kind of a blur to him. He spoke Spanish, but he never got in a position where he had to answer somebody in French. That's the way he puts it. He said, he would wave or nod or, somehow acknowledge the questioner. And he knew enough German so when they asked for identification, he could quickly pull it out. He knew enough there, but he was not fluent in French by any means.
You had one more question back here.
Yes, sir.
At what point did your father get word back to your mother that he was alive?
About 3 months after he was in Switzerland. The way it was done was through code, basically. The wife of the military attaché sent through commercial RCA trunk lines but we really enjoy it here in the snow, wish you could join us, et cetera, and signed her name. But she knew that meant my father was still alive. And then shortly after, the Army Air Forces sent a person to their house and explained that he was interned in a neutral country. He can't communicate, but he is alive, and periodically we will tell you that. But she didn't know for 3 months.